Sorry, never mind. It's also called a convenience sample. And the idea is that it is accidental because there was no role for the researcher to pick the sample. Okay. Um, so for example, if I do a research project and my sample, the example I gave was my sample is the bunch of students we have in this course. Uh, I've really not picked you as students. I didn't look at all the students at Laurentian and pick the students. So it is an accidental sample because I had no control in you students showing up to this course. Accidental quota is an extension of accidental sampling. And the way it works is if I'm comparing 50 Francophone students to 50 Anglophone students, in terms of, let's say, mental health support on campus. Now, I may pick, if I picked the 50 and 50 from a class of 300, say I went to an introduction to chemistry. Those are one of the big classes on campus where you have 300 plus students, right? One of those ridiculous auditorium size, right? So I pick 50 and 50. The reason it's still accidental is I didn't really have a choice. I may have, I show up to the class and I just pick 50 students and I just pick 50. It's still accidental because I showed up to the class where I had no decision making involved in picking who would show up to class. So that's why it is still accidental, but because there's a quota, because there's a fixed number, I want to compare the same number, it's called a quota sample. Purpose of sampling is a little bit different in the sense you are picking a sample to study a very specific property. For example, if you wanted to look at, oh, come on, pen. All right. If you want to look at, let's say, reasons for picking a certain science course by liberal arts students. So let's assume you want to understand what makes a student in a liberal arts program. A liberal arts program would be like English or French. Gerontology would be a social science, communication studies would be a social science, but religious study would be liberal arts. So let's just say we pick students from religious studies, we pick students from English, we pick students from, let's say, French. So the thing is, because we are looking very purposefully to find out the decisions behind taking certain types of science courses because it's required by Laurentian University, we have purposefully, for a very specific purpose, chosen students who only have this as their major, or this as their major, or this as their major. Okay, it could be one, it could be three, whatever it is. The point is, it's done with a purpose. So that's why we exclude communication studies and so on, because the sample is picked for a very specific purpose. Now, there may be an element of randomness introduced after deciding the purpose of sample or not, and it depends on the scientist entirely, and we'll talk about these combined techniques after. Snowball sampling. Everybody remembers this, right? Snowball sampling. Come on, tell me example. Give me an example of snowball sampling.
You somehow get lucky speaking with one person, and then that person recommends another person.
Okay, Marianne says you basically have to find out your first contact, and hopefully they lead you to multiple contacts. And your sample is more of a sequential sample because one person leads you to the next, leads you to the next. And whenever people use snowball sampling, it can be a matter of years before you have a complete sample of a certain nature to be able to finish your research, and that's fine. That's the nature of snowball sampling. And there are sorry.
Sorry, I was just. Can you give an example of like when you would use that?
Snowball sample?
Yeah.
Okay, let's make an example. Now you want to find out from East Indian people. So there are a lot of East Indians coming into Canada. And I'm just taking this because I'm East Indian and I know I'm not offending myself, so it's fine. So there are lots of East Indian students coming to Canada to study, okay? Now, perhaps you may know someone who's a recent immigrant, perhaps you don't. So now you are interested in understanding the question, why are students from India coming to Canada to study? And so what you do is you somehow are able to contact one student through a friend of a friend of a friend or whatever. And then you have a bunch of questions or a questionnaire that you have out for them, which may have questions regarding quality of life, which may have questions regarding financial prospects, which may have questions regarding staying away from mom and dad. That's important. And so on, whatever be your questions. So you run your survey with the first person and then you say, hey, listen, I mean, I don't mean to stereotype, but do you know any other East Indian students that I might be able to talk to? And the guy says, oh, sure, picks up his phone and gives you 2 more. Of course, in the case of East Indian students, you may have 20 more, which is fine because you're looking for more data, right? So they might give you a couple more and then you go interview the 2 more. And then once you're done your interview or your questionnaire that you've given them, you ask them, would you mind connecting me to 2 more people? Because one of the things you have to understand is when people come from different countries, they don't necessarily know what you're doing properly. They may not understand. They may also be suspicious. Okay. A different example would be, suppose you wanted to understand how I can't remember what is it the celebration that First Nations people have. I forget the name for that. Do you guys remember?
Powwow, no.
Powwow, yes, thank you. Thank you. Yes, so powwows are often open to public, but you may want to participate in a powwow, or you might want to ask Native First Nation students how they feel about organizing powwows and having people from outside come in and join them. You may not know a single First Nation student, so what do? Well, you probably email the chair of Indigenous Studies in Laurentian and say, hey, listen, this is what I want to know and understand and research. Can you connect me to somebody? So they go ahead, give you a couple of names, and hopefully they're friendly people and they are open to your idea of asking them questions, and they give you a couple of answers and they say, listen, I mean, I would really like if you can connect me to somebody else. And then they set you with a couple more people. So then it snowballs. Basically start with smaller sizes, 1 or 2, and then you end up with each person giving you more connections, maybe with 20, 30, 40 samples. Does that explain stuff?
Yes, thank you.
No problem.
It's also good for populations of people who maybe aren't likely to use services, or like, for example, drug addicts who are homeless, that, you could approach one and they connect you with other people.
Yes, hard to access populations. Great point, Connie, because you have to understand that there's a lot of stigma around a lot of different types of populations. For example, addicts, call them users, homeless people,
transgendered people,
transgender, yeah. It's former inmates, right? Prison inmates.
yeah.
Yeah, so snowball sampling is particularly effective when you are trying to draw a sample which is quote unquote hidden, right? So all of these tend to be an interesting way to kind of get information, okay? The last type of non-random sampling we'll look at is systematic matching. Systematic matching, it's a little tricky. It's not the best, but sometimes you're stuck with picking the sample that you can find. It is very useful when your population sizes are different. So for example, if you are picking the amount of, if you're studying, so let's say, let's pick a topic, you're studying mental health support on campus. Okay, if that's what you want to study and you want to see what students feel about it, and your assumption is, well, the amount of support provided to Native students and their perception of it is different, and I want to understand how they feel about it. What you might do is you might systematically match, and the population sizes are different because it is, at least on Laurentian campus, the number of non-native students greatly outnumber native students, okay? So when you're trying to ask this question, you can't do a random sample because you'll disproportionately get non-native students. You pick a certain set of native students, maybe female, male, female, male. But what you also do is you also pick non-native students. You systematically match, which means you pick, if you have a native student that you've picked who has a good physical health profile, who hasn't necessarily experienced in the previous generation the residential school system, who has generally had a certain kind of background, urban, raised urban in an urban environment, not on a reserve, perhaps the parents were both educated, then you pick a comparable female student for your non-native, okay? So basically you're matching the two for certain subsets of attributes. You do the same for each one. Say, for example, one of the native students you have has a lot of mental health challenges, and the factors are perhaps poverty in early life, maybe malnutrition, maybe parents, maybe it was the family environment wasn't a stable environment, maybe there was abuse involved. So from questionnaires that you might initially administer to pick your sample, you may pick someone with a similar profile. Okay, this is a systematic matching. A systematic matching could have different criteria, such as educational background, or just socioeconomic status, or health medical background. So either way, basically you try to match profiles on whatever criteria it is selected. The reason it's systematic is you're actually selecting or sifting through a system of things to match these two people. So when you actually have these samples set up this way and then you administer your interviews, the chances that you're comparing apples to apples is very high. And that's the whole point of doing systematic matching. Okay. Any questions? Any clarification needed for one or more?
Yet.
Okay. Not yet, okay. All right, we'll move forward. So those are the types of non-random sampling. Random sampling is different. Random sampling, as I explained to you last time, is when the researcher doesn't recognize that there is a bias. If the researcher doesn't know what bias exists, then it's considered random. Now, this does not mean that the sample itself is truly random, because there might be a bias, but you really don't know. So the simplest type of random sampling is called simple random sampling. Okay. Examples of simple random sampling are pulling out numbers from a bingo cage. Does everybody know what that means? Anybody needs explanation?
Pulling out numbers from a hat.
Numbers from a hat, as Marianne says. Um, if you haven't played around enough with calculators, most scientific calculators have a feature which says this. RAN and then hashtag. That means random number. You can do it on your iPhone too. When you tilt your iPhone sideways, if you get your iPhone horizontal like this, you will see the random number. And what that essentially does is when you hit that, it'll give you a random number, just random. You have no control over it. There's a chip in your calculator or your phone which just pumps out a random number, completely random. Okay, so there are different ways to have random. And so when you have simple random sampling, what you do is you pick up samples. So if you were to pick numbers, then you would use a calculator or a phone. If you were to pick out colored marbles, you have a bunch of marbles in a bag, you can't see what's in the bag, you put your hand in and pick something out. So this is, it's basically simple random sampling. Systematic sampling is a little bit different. Now, the systematic matching, which we saw in non-random sampling, is different from systematic sampling. Systematic sampling is, it is still random because you're not controlling stuff, okay? But you have a system. And an example of that is, I want students to pick 100 residents from the city of Sudbury that I'm going to call on the phone, okay? So I take my phone book. Nobody uses a phone book. Does anybody know what's a phone book anymore?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I just didn't know if my stuff is too outdated. Anyway, since phone books still exist, we'll use the phone book example. You have a phone book. The phone book has white pages, which has people's names and phone numbers, okay? Now, you can count the number of pages. Let's say number of pages, and we're just going to have round, convenient numbers just for fun, okay? Number of pages equals 100, okay? Now, what you do is you say that because it's 100 pages, I'm going to pick a name from page 1. Oh, well, I need 100 names, so I'm going to pick one name from each page. So then your friend asks you, your co-researcher asks you, well, how are you going to pick the one name from one page? What's going to be your method? So if it were a random thing, you can have mix of methods too. But if it were systematic random and you say one per page, but every page I'm just going to close my eyes and I'm just going to go touch something and wherever my finger lands, that's the name I pick. So then your friend says, okay, well, that's fine. But then if it were more systematic, what you'd do is you'd pick one name per page, and what you'd do is you'd pick the 10th name from the top. It doesn't have to be from the top. It can be 10th name from the bottom. It doesn't matter. The reason it's called systematic is because you have a system. And what it does is it eliminates any other kind of bias you may have if you were to actually read the name and pull something out, okay? A stratified random sample is a mix of a quota. So you have a quota sample, which you remember from non-random sampling, you have a certain number of people involved. And what you do is when you have the quota, you randomize within the quota. So for example, let's say for the mental health services, I had to pick Native students. But I say that I have 50 Native students that I need for my study. Can't spell students. There we go. 50 native students. But I'm a very lucky professor and I have 100 native students in my class. So I know that I'm definitely going to get 50 out of these, right? How do I pick the 50 that I need? What am I going to do? There are many ways it can be done. So help me out here.
Asking who wants to participate.
Okay. Let's say all 100 put their hands up. I want to be part of the study. Marianne says ask students. I made it a little more complicated.
Okay. The students that best relate.
But then it's random.
It has to be random, Aretha.
Oh.
It has to
Can
be
you
random.
Close your eyes and just point. And
You could. So you could have them stand in a circle. You could have them stand in a circle and you could spin around and one of them would yell stop, and wherever your finger pointed, it'd pick that person. You could do that. Or what Marianne says is put all the 100 names in a hat and pull names out. Okay. Or you could each ask them to stand in a row and say 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, you know, randomly, and you pick all the odds or all the evens or and so on. Okay, so there are many ways to do this. The reason it is still random despite you picking a certain type of students is because you stratified that group by saying I would like native students only for the sample. Stratified means strengthened. So anytime you stratify a sample, you are strengthening for a particular trait. In this case, you strengthened for native students. Basically, your pool of students that you pick from are all native students. You've already stratified it. But it is randomized within that stratified pool. Okay, and you could either pull out of a hat, you could do the little, you could close your eyes and point to people, whatever works. Okay, as long as there's no bias from your side amongst those 100, it would still be considered a form of random sampling.
the stratified part of it, I was trying to reason out until you just explained it a while ago.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
the stratified is, yeah. So for example, if I want to have a sample of 50 people who live below the poverty line to understand their usage of food banks, okay? In that situation, I might have a pool of 1,000 people, but obviously I don't want to interview all 1,000, or I don't want to have 1,000 questionnaires. So I might use a stratified, a random sample from the 1,000 itself. But I've already stratified because I've identified the large pool that's willing to help me. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Cluster sampling is another type of random sampling, and it's a little bit different. So if I want to measure the frequency that the neighborhood Tim Hortons is used as a venue for socialization between 9 and 5 for older adults, let's say I have a theory. Okay, my theory is, let's write the hypothesis down first so everything gets clearer. My pen refuses to cooperate today, but we'll get it to work. So I have a hypothesis that neighborhood Tim Hortons are a popular meeting and social venue for older adults between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. Obviously, this is completely unpacked, so we'd have to specify more details. But if this is the broad conceptual hypothesis, because we have to break down what popular means, what a social venue means, which older adults are we talking about. So, but we'll put that aside for now. Let's just assume that this is what we wish to study, okay? Now, because I'm trying to study something so general and so broad, I'm going to have to pick the Tim Hortons. So which Tim Hortons do I pick? I live in the lively Norton area. Do I just pick my neighborhood Tim Hortons? Do I pick the Tim Hortons on campus? Do I pick the Tim Hortons on, say, Martindale Road in Sudbury? Which Tims do I pick? Do I pick Tim Hortons in GTA? Do I pick Tim Hortons in Timmins? What do I do? So to ease that issue, there is a method of random sampling. So this is a multiple step of random sampling. So first I got to think about how many Tim Hortons are there in Canada? Okay, so then I come to the conclusion, well, there are about 3,000 Tim Hortons in Canada. Okay. I'm not interested in observing 3,000 Tim Hortons. I'm not interested in showing up in all of them either. So I say, okay, I would like to maybe observe 30 Tim Hortons. So my sample size is 30. So now what do I do? Do I just randomize from the 3,000? Then I'm thinking, okay, if I randomize from the 3,000 itself, the problem that's going to occur is large cities like Toronto and Montreal will get overrepresented, right? Because a big city like the GTA, a big urban setting like the GTA would have upwards of 200 Tim Hortons, okay, 200, 250 Tim Hortons. So even if I'm picking random samples, I'll have more samples coming from the GTA than any place else. I'm thinking, okay, well, we have to have a randomizing within that step, okay? So then what I do is I list Tim Hortons by city type. So I'm creating clusters of Tim Hortons. So I have Toronto, Brampton, Mississauga, Scarborough, Burlington.
Oh, so your clusters could
Yeah,
be like an area like the east. So you're looking at maybe Niagara Falls, like you say,
right. So
Pickering, Scarborough.
yeah, exactly. So I'm listing pretty much all the major cities that have Tim Hortons. Okay. Once I have my list of cities, Sudbury, North Bay, I might have 20, 30 of them. So now I have different clusters. So now I randomize. So I give each one of them a number, say 1, 2, 3, whatever it is. And then I pick up my calculator and press the random number function, and it spits out a number, which is the number of city I pick. I may not get Toronto because it wasn't picked up in the random sample. I may get Brampton, I may get Mississauga, and so on. So I first get my clusters of cities. Now within those cities, there are many Tim Hortons. I can't go to all of them. So now I label each of those Tim Hortons within those cities with a number, and then I pick numbers from each cluster. So I've randomized the cities, I've randomized the Tim Hortons within the cities, and I've picked individual Tim Hortons for a grand total of 30, because 30 is all I'm willing to work with. Do you understand how this has worked? 2 levels of randomization. Okay.
Can I ask, is it like they do zoning, like for roundabout election time, you have ridings, and within the ridings you have, I guess, your council members or something like that? So you have your MP, you have your MPP, and you have these, is this something like that, like East York and?
Well, so the way it's done is you distribute provinces. I can't draw the map of Ontario. I'm
Oh,
awful.
it's okay. It's okay.
I'm just going to make a random figure and we'll pretend it's Ontario just for fun. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. And let's say these are the big cities in the south here. So you have Toronto here, GTA, and these are all the other big cities.
Mm-hmm.
Typically what happens is your geographical areas or districts for elections, they are distributed by population. Okay, so there's a two level, and I should know more about this, and I don't. But my understanding is your distribution. So, for example, the GTA will have a lot more MPPs going into the provincial parliament than say Sudbury or Timmins. Even though area-wise, Sudbury is massive. Sudbury is bigger than the first 7 cities of Ontario combined.
Wow.
Yeah, so you can fit Toronto, Mississauga, Brampton, Scarborough, Burlington, Hamilton, Niagara Falls, Kitchener, Waterloo, all inside Sudbury. Sudbury is massive. Yes, Sudbury is massive, but the population density is very, very, very low. Okay, so to get from one end of Sudbury to another is about an hour and 15 minutes change. The boundaries of Greater Sudbury are massive. However, the number of MPPs that Sudbury has is 2, right? Because it reflects the population. The number of MPPs coming from the GTA is, I don't know how much it is, but it's probably in the 30s or 40s. And I'll give an example. My wife lives in a condo in Ottawa, and that building has its own postal code. Okay, because that building has 200 apartments. So it has its own postal code. There are 3 buildings on site. Each building has its own postal code. Now, for people who live in Toronto, this is not new to you. You probably are aware of the fact that a building can have a postal code.
Yeah.
For me, coming from Sudbury, it's the weirdest thing ever. How can it have its own postal code? It's a building, right? But it does. So it is population based. So it's a little bit different than cluster sample. And there's really no sampling there for elections. They just do it around populations and the number of voters, potential voters that might represent. Go ahead, Courtney. Yeah. So it becomes systematic when you have a system. So for example, so Courtney's question, let me explain the question to everybody remotely. Courtney's question is, if you were using the Tim Hortons example, and instead of going the way you did by randomizing all 3,000, we just decided to go by province, and we decided to say, pick 2 Tim Hortons from each province. Is that what you're thinking? Okay. So yeah, but you'd have to make it systematic sampling. So the question is, can that be absolutely? You can make it systematic. So then you don't treat clusters. So none of these sampling methods are exclusive of each other. So you can make one look like another. So if you take cluster sampling, so you have clusters of Tim Hortons in each province, and you say that you're only going to pick 2, you can decide that once you list all the Tim Hortons in each province, you're going to pick the 32nd and the 43rd Tim Hortons on the list. Okay. As long as you're consistent in pulling out those samples and you've specified the system, it would be a systematic sample. Okay, so you can have systematic sample built into cluster sampling. So you can have these clusters and then you can build in systematic sampling within it. It could also be cluster sampling with just cluster samples with just random sampling involved. So you have these clusters and you just pull a ball out of a hat for the Tim Hortons that you're gonna. So you can go either way with it. Okay. Yep. So that is pretty much it for random sampling. We So go ahead, read your textbook, read the examples. I like the fact that they have very different examples than what I present in class, because the idea is the more examples you read and you're familiar with, the more you understand how it works. If you are just left with, if I give you the exact same examples as the textbook, then you don't have a diversity of examples. And I don't think it helps the understanding process quite as much. Now, sample size. Sample size is very important because size is a good predictor of the population, okay? In an ideal world, and we've discussed this before, if you can measure the entire population, why bother with samples? Typically when you get Stats Canada data, which is based on census, you don't really need to take a sample because that's a complete measure of the population, right? But let's take a step back. For the purposes of research, what is a population?
It is the specific group or area that you're interested to get data on, about, or from. So if for census, for government purposes, it would be people, different demographic groups. For, I don't know, if you were in a lab and looking for a certain culture, then you would look for bodies that would carry certain pathogens or something like that. It's the area of focus that you're interested to learn about or to answer questions about.
Thank you, Aretha. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about, and that's good. So a population just refers to the idea of individual samples or individual specimens. In research terms, particularly in statistical research, population doesn't often always represent people. And this is good to understand. So for example, if I wanted to survey, I wanted to randomly select. So let's make an example. I want a random sample of literature for teenagers. So I'm thinking about storybooks, okay? Novels. To study implicit sexism, okay? Okay, so I am interested. So this is my hypothesis. My hypothesis is that most books written for adolescents, teenagers are favored as showing that the male is the hero or the protagonist, and the female is often in a subservient or minor role. So there's an inherent sexism that is presented in books for teenagers, at least in the years 1980 to 2000, let's say in that 20-year period, okay? So obviously I can't pick and choose books, because if I pick all Nancy Drew novels, I'm going to say this is bullshit. It's the girl that's the hero, right? I can't pick all Hardy Boys because there's no role for girls in those books. So I need a random sample. So we understand what a sample is now, but we need a sample that represents the population. What is the population here?
Teenagers today.
That's where you'd be making a mistake, right? The population is not about people. The population is, yes, all the novels written in that period. Okay, and you can make the research question more specific, saying written in English, written in North America, or written by North American authors, and so on. Right? Just keep it simple. But the population would be all of the novels that were written in that 20-year time frame. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so a population for research purposes has nothing to do with humans, animals, life forms. It can, it doesn't have to. Okay, so when people are talking about something like this, if they're talking about, say, blatant or overt sexism that comes through and stereotypes boys a certain way and girls a certain way, and they want to study novels, then your population is all of the novels. And when you pick a random sample as a representative of the population, you're randomizing all the books, and then you're picking a random sample, whether it's systematic random or whichever way you pick. Okay. So the population is defined, the sample tries to define the population. If you understand what the sample is, it's very easy for you to understand what the population is. Okay, researchers will often communicate both quite clearly in their paper, saying this is what we wish to study, so we took a random sample of this. So for example, if you're checking bone density in people taking calcitonin, calcitonin is a hormone that increases bone density. Your population might not be people. Your population might be a bunch of x-rays. Okay, before and after. You may not even know the patient. You may just have before and after x-rays. So your population is 3,000 x-rays which have been matched before and after. Does that make sense? Okay, I'll assume that it does. So typically when you have data, what you do is you create a data analysis. I call this a dummy table, not because the table is stupid, but because it's a practice table, right? Anyway, so if I'm going to look at the population, if I'm looking at income, then it's a good idea to have a sample, because the city of Sudbury, for example, has 170,000 people. If I have a predictor saying people who will pay money to enroll in a nutrition program, okay, and I say that people who make more money are typically more likely to enroll in a nutrition program. So for example, I have different incomes down. The numbers could have been anything. I just made these numbers up. So yeah, you create a dummy table, and hopefully from the random sample that you pick, you get answers which predict one way or the other. Okay. I think that might be pretty much all I have to say for sampling. Does anybody have any questions for this chapter? Okay, I have been logged out. I'm going to go log back in. Oh, stop. All right. We'll answer the questions at the end of the sampling chapter and see how many we can. I think we should be able to get through all of them. Okay. Okay, question 1. Why do researchers use sampling procedures? I want at least 2 reasons.
You can't survey everyone, so you have to sample a smaller group.
Yep, so it's physically and financially probably impossible to sample everybody.
Would it be to eliminate bias? Or does that just work with non-random?
Yeah, because you might be stuck with non-random, right? And then there's no room for eliminating. There is bias there. So yeah, it's physically and financially impossible to study everyone. Any other reason why we take a sample?
To make a generalization about the population?
To make it can be used to make a generalization, sometimes not, depending on the type of sample. Random sample, so you could answer saying may be used for generalization as opposed to will be used. Okay, and go through the chapter. There are multiple reasons you can talk. You can address it specifically. You can have a point saying random samples are more representative of the larger population that we want to ask questions from. Non-random samples are chosen to answer very specific questions. In either case, it makes more sense to have either a targeted population as in non-random sampling or a randomized sample in case of studies which involve an unbiased view of the larger population. So, you can have 3 or 4 different points there, but if you give me a couple, I'll be satisfied. Why is it risky to rely on the observation of a single case in making generalization about groups?
That particular case might not be representative of the larger population. So I think that's where the bias comes in.
A lack of representativeness. Absolutely, and I think that's the right answer. You can't guarantee that it represents the group. What are the 2 basic types of sampling procedures?
Random and non-random?
Yep. What are the advantages and disadvantages of each sampling procedure? Okay, so this is going to come up with a list of things. So let's do one. Let's make a little table. Let's see how we can do this. Okay, what are the advantages of random sampling?
I guess you're pulling from a wider pool.
Bigger pool,
Eliminate bias.
eliminate bias, representative.
Yeah.
What else can we think of random sampling? Well, I think I'll take 3. Okay, so if random sampling is so awesome, why don't we use random all the time? Why do we use non-random sampling?
Because you may need certain criterias for your sample.
May need to study something very specific. Okay. Maybe stuck with the sample that you have.
Yeah, you may only have access to
Yeah.
10 people out of the 30.
Yeah. Right. You may have difficulty accessing. Think about snowball sampling. You may have difficulty accessing a sample.
Could it be more practical in some instances, like in accidental sampling, when you have access to a population already?
It's more practical?
In certain situations, maybe, but not like all of them. Like let's say you wanted to study, what was the example they used, the sociology class, and you're in the sociology class and you want to study that particular class.
Right, exactly. So yeah, it may be a more practical way to research a particular group that you already have access to. True. So the way I would answer this question is think about each method of non-random sampling, each of those techniques, and then you know why you did that, right? So those are your arguments to use non-random sampling, right? When we want to study a specific group, when you don't want a random sampling because you're specifically trying to understand the difference in mindset between students that come from India versus students that come from the Caribbean, right? You really want to pick those two groups, right? And always remember, even though you have this very clear distinction in your textbook as random and non-random, researchers will often mix. So for example, if you have accidental quota sampling, so for example, I stumble upon a sociology class with 300 students, I want to study 50 francophones and 50 anglophones. I might have 50 francophones, that might be all the francophones in my 300 student class, but then 250 are anglophones. I might randomize within those anglophones, right? If they're willing to do research.
Going back to your earlier example in the course of the traffic light with the people coming through, those people, those drivers, would that be random or non-random?
It would be random because you have no control in deciding who's going to go through the lights.
Okay, but
or who's going to
you're
drive on
stuck
the
with
road.
what you got when they come through, though. That's why I wondered.
Sorry, what's that again?
I said you're stuck with the selection that comes through, and I just wondered if that was.
You're not stuck with them because you never, like, you don't know who's going to go. Like, an accidental
Oh, okay.
situation is students in my class, I know who's going to be there.
Okay.
I have control over the sample. And that's the difference with the traffic lights, because you really don't have control. You might be there at a certain time. You really can't tell who's going to go, who's going to break the red light.
Unless you know that Joe down the street is going to come through at 3:45.
Right. If you're a stocky kind of person, maybe, but most people aren't, so no, right? That's why that's still considered random. Okay, what are the advantages and disadvantages? I'll let you do that. I'm not going to do a do-over because we just did all of that. Number 5, what are the steps that must be taken in order to truly draw a random sample? Okay, so there is a systematic way to draw a random sample. We spoke about the hat and other stuff, but let's just go back for a second and then we will look at the chapter where it has specific steps for drawing a random sample.
If you're looking at jury duty,
Yes.
They have certain criterias, don't they? And so when they
100%.
Yeah.
So when what happens is, as a citizen of Canada, we are all required to show up for jury duty. Okay, the process of picking people for jury duty is actually random. However, once you show up, the 100 people that show up, and only 8 will form, or 9 will form the jury, because you'll have a foreman and then you'll have 8 people, something like that. Okay, the lawyers then pick and choose within those 100 people to pick the 8 most, what they consider disconnected from the theme at large people, so that there can be an unbiased decision. And so there's non-randomized picking within the random sample.
Okay.
Let's see if we can get to the page that goes through the steps about random samples. Choosing a sampling procedure. I should have written down the page number. That would have been helpful. There we go. We are here. So
What program do you have your book in?
So they have an electronic format for the book.
Oh, I could have imported it into Kurzweil.
Sorry?
I could have imported it into Kurzweil.
Well, it's only available to instructors for the moment.
Oh, okay.
I have recommended that they make it available to students. So they asked me for recommendation. So that's what I've said. So maybe next year it will be available. Not this year, unfortunately. Okay, so if you go through the steps, at page 163, there's a whole write-up on the steps that you can use to randomize a sample. It is pretty much more of the same thing. So for example, they're talking about picking 50 students from 250 sociology students. Each student, you number the student from 1 to 250, and you select from a table of random numbers, or you can use your calculator or your iPhone to generate random numbers. Tables of random numbers are available in your textbook as well. I believe it's in the appendix areas. So in the old days when calculators were too expensive for people, they would give people these sheets of random numbers so that people could actually, once you numbered 250 students down, you could go ahead and pick the fifth number from the top of each page or whatever you wished. And then because on the basis of those numbers, you could pick out of your 250 numbers, and you'd have no control of the situation because everything is completely biased. And those numbers that the sheets had would not be in sequence anyway, okay? So anyway, so page 164 is where you want to go to talk about the steps. There are many ways to do it, but we won't belabor about them in class right now. Okay. Name 2 steps that might damage our ability to draw a random sample. 2 things that can truly damage a random sample would be a bias in the process of randomization. So let's think of an example how you can bias randomization. So if you want to draw a truly unbiased sample, and let's take the example of 50 students in sociology from 250 students. Now, all of a sudden what I do is I start picking random students from different corners in the classroom. Now, the reason it may not be totally unbiased is if I have a large enough classroom, students often tend to cluster in different areas, right? So if I pick students from different areas, so if I map the classroom into different quadrants, this is my classroom, I map it into different quadrants based on where the students are sitting, and I say I'm going to pick 4 out of these. And I end up picking, or 4, let's say two students or 1 student from each quadrant. So I may pick up 1 from here, 1 from here, 1 from here, 1 from here, and so on. But the issue is I may have very few students sitting in the front row. So I might just pick 1 out of 1, okay? And here I might be picking 1 out of 10. And it creates a problem for randomness is even though I have no control over where students sit, there's an inherent bias as to where students like to sit in the class. The students that want more privacy so that they can be on whatever Instagram or anything, they will sit huddled in groups with, doing that. The students who are keeners and want to make sure that they create a positive impression are more likely to be perhaps not right in front, but closer to where they can hear and contribute and participate, right? So there are inherent biases, and that is the bias in the process of randomization in that situation. Even though I haven't really picked the grids because of how I choose the students, there might be some bias involved. Okay. The other step is not recognizing that the sample itself that I'm drawing from may be a biased sample. So for example, if I want to study student attitudes towards courses in French, and I pick a random sample, but I pull it all out of English-speaking courses, right? That would be an inherent bias. Anyway, so go ahead, read the section on sampling, and think of other options as well. What are the critical issues in determining sample size? So how big a sample should you have? That's what this question is asking.
Would it depend on what you were trying to study? But I think you'd want to get enough, a big enough size that you can acquire all of the information you need about the population.
Big enough and representative of the population. It depends on your question, okay? And depends, you should have a sample that represents the population. Go ahead, Courtney. Oh, that's a great question. So Courtney's question is, does sample size matter in qualitative versus quantitative research? 100%, right? Well, because in quantitative research generally tends to have larger representative populations. Quantitative research. Qualitative research may or may not care about sample size. So it depends on the kind of research you're doing. If your task is to have interviews to understand what the experiences of residential school were, you don't really, you will not get the in-depth richness by having 200. I mean, yeah, it'd be great to have 200 interviews, but you don't have that kind of time. So you're going to get personal narratives from 4 or 5 people. They may be completely non-random because you may have to have used a snowball method or a different kind of method to acquire the sample. So samples, sorry, go ahead.
Isn't quantitative collection of data easier to do in larger numbers than qualitative? Because you're qualitative to analyze, unless you're getting a computer to pick out the words that they say in it, it requires a lot more effort and time and for each person sampled.
100%, Samantha. So the way quantitative research works is, as you mentioned, you can get larger sample size, you get numerical data, you sift through all the data, and you make sense of it so that you can apply it also to a larger population. Qualitative doesn't make that presumption that we're going to apply all this information to a broad population. It tries to understand the problem in the first place. And the thing about qualitative data is you don't define the sample size ahead of time. Sometimes you may be limited. I may only have 3 students on campus that I can interview about their experience in Gero 3127. I may be limited by that, but in an ideal world, I would like to interview as many as possible to find coherent themes and so on. So in qualitative, what happens is, because of the nature of the work, say it's interviews, semi-structured, structured, or whatever it is, or personal narratives, you first get all the information. And even when you use the issue with computer-based thematic analysis is people speak differently. Everybody speaks differently. People don't, except for commonly used phrases, people construct their thoughts, their words very, very differently. Yes, computers might help, and they do that. So what was I reading this morning? Anyway, can't remember the podcast anymore. They were talking about 33,000 interviews. So they are analyzing 33,000 interviews. I don't remember what the situation was. So they had to use a computer to narrow things down because it's such a massive volume and it would take decades to sift through that data. But for the most part, people don't engage in that kind of a study for qualitative research. And you actually keep adding to your sample, because what happens is, say, for example, a common theme about mental health support on campus at Laurentian University is the inadequacy of counselors, or the long time it takes you to meet a counselor. Let's say that's a recurring theme. And that's a very dominant theme. So you continue to find more people to interview till you have saturated that theme, till you can get no more new information about why it's hard to get someone to speak to. Okay, or let's say suicide prevention, and you're talking about that, and then you find that, well, within 3 people you're starting to get exactly the same things. By the time you get to the 4th and 5th person, you find that you're really not getting anything new, so you stop collecting more samples because you've hit what is known as saturation, right? So qualitative tends to be very different. You don't predetermine sample size a lot of the time, and you keep collecting or working through samples maybe 1, 2, 3 times till you hit what is known as quote unquote saturation. So it's different, it's more intensive, and yeah, your sample size is not that big of a deal in a lot of qualitative research. Okay, so we will pause now. We'll continue with questions 7 through, I believe, 14. Oh, well, we have test next class. So we will do it after your midterm exam. Now, for your midterm exam, an email will be in your inbox for 9:45 a.m. on Monday. It has very specific step-by-step directions with cartoons and pictures showing you what you need to do, in addition to words. And the reason I felt like doing that was I was having a good time. But I think it should be relatively simple to go through the steps and get to your midterm exam and answer everything. By default, your cameras will be on when you enter the meeting. Please do not turn them off. It is only for this midterm that I need to be able to see people writing the exam. Students in class, we have 3 students today, please bring your laptops. If you do not bring your laptops, you can use your phone, but I recommend, if you don't want to blame the phone for making errors, bring your laptop. Better way to do it. Your scheduled time for your midterm is 50 minutes. You have 41 questions, not 40. 1 question is bonus. So whatever you get out of 41 will be out of 40. Okay. What else? You will get your score at the end. When you finish all your midterm, your score will be shown to you. It's not being shared with your classmates. You will only see your score. You won't, when you answer each of the questions, it won't tell you if it's correct or wrong because it's going to give you a score at the end. So you can't guess around with different answers, but you are able to navigate through the entire test. Like say you answer question number 41 and you feel like going back to question number 25, you can do that. That's not an issue. Okay. Question from Courtney. Yes, 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 yes. You can go back and change. That's not an issue. Okay. All right. Well, good luck to everybody, and we will see everyone on Monday.
I have a question. It's not about this class though. So when we do our presentations next week for directed studies,
Yes.
Roughly how long do you want like the slides? Like how many slides do you want?
Oh, I'm going to send that email like in the next, I would say 30, 35 minutes with specific directions for your presentations. So I want each presentation to be no longer than 15 minutes. So anywhere between 10 and 15 minutes is plenty. So if you want to stop at 10, you're not going to get penalized. We'll use the additional minutes to ask questions and have discussions. Okay. If you wanted to talk for all the 15 minutes, that's fine too. And then we'll use a couple of minutes after for question and answers between your peers and myself. Okay. So anyway, I'll put that down in an email so you have it in front of you as you're preparing your slides.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.